Okay, we're up to Daf70a-70b is at the very end of the line. The last thing the Gemara was discussing was it had a shaila like this. You have a fruit or a vegetable that begins to grow in a certain halachic situation. Let's say it begins to grow as climb, it begins to grow as arla, trumas, the oimer passes by when it already begins to grow, and then it continues to grow. Or it's replanted and it continues to grow way more. So the question is, do you look at it as the growth is just an extension of the root, and whatever the root is, the growth is. So let's say the root is climb, so then the growth is also climb, or no. There's the root, which is climb, and then there's the growth with, let's say the situation is that the climb no longer applies. Let's say the vineyard is removed. So you have the root, which is the growth, that's climb. The growth afterwards is not climb, and if you have more than 200, it should be nullified. That was the Gemara's discussion yesterday. So the Gemara says, Rav Asakasha, Le'inyan Meiser Mai. What is the halacha regarding Meiser in this situation? Now, what's the case? Heichidami, what exactly is the case? Kigoin, de'amdinu v'asarinu, v'shaslinu, v'hoisiflu. Okay, basically the case is like this. You have a piece of grain, you have some grain. You separate Meiser on the grain. Okay, so the grain is good. Then you replant it in the ground. The question is, does the growth, now it begins to grow from that. So couple options. Number one, the growth is an extension of the original, and the original already has meiser, so the growth doesn't need to be taken meiser. Or, no, the growth is separate, meiser needs to be taken, and more than that, perhaps you have to redo meiser on what was planted. Meaning, although I planted these kernels meiser was already taken care of, but when I plant them in the ground, if what grew from it is larger than the original, and we look at the growth as independent, and it's roiv, so maybe not only does the growth need meiser, but you need to separate meiser on the seeds of the original kernels as well. So let's say you have, you planted 10 of them, I don't know the Metzias. I guess you could have more growth than the original seeds, I guess because it breaks down, I don't know. Let's say you plant 10, and then you have, at the end of the day, you have a field of like 100 that came out of it. So the question is, are you separating meiser for the 90, or including the 10, not including the 10? In other words, is it possible you have to take meiser again on what was planted? Well, can I be honest with you? Every single time that you do this, you have to. I mean, the majority cases, think about it, you have seeds, right, from fruits or vegetables that you took away meiser. You plant them in the ground, and then what's grown, you have to take meiser again. We don't deduct the amount of seeds. We don't say, well, the seeds already had meiser, right? You say take meiser? No, you take meiser second time. No one. Right? If you take off meiser money, it's not the same. You take off meiser money, then reinvest. You make some money. You take off again. I'm saying it happens all the time. So if you have the seeds, right? So seeds. You separate meiser from sunflower seed, whatever. You separate meiser already. You replant them, and then a whole field grows. You just separate meiser on everything. We don't deduct from the amount of seeds that we don't do that. We take a meiser second time. The only question is whether wheat kernels are different. But I'm saying the average situation, that's what's happening. So the Gemara says, Amalei Rava, Maishna Mekol Chiti. I'm sorry, the Gemara says, Imtim Ziloimar Loyaz Lina Basar Iker V'Tesavis Bayasuri Iker Mai. Let's assume you have to take meiser on what grew. We don't look at it as an extension of the root. We look at what's grow is independent, needs to be meiser. But perhaps you also have to take meiser again on the root, because the majority, you go by saroiv. And if the roiv of this plant needs meiser, then maybe you need to be meiser on the root as well. So the Gemara says, well, Amrle Abaya, Maishur Mekol Chiti V'Sari Dalma. Isn't this every case of planting? You have seeds from fruits or vegetables that you separated meiser. You take the seeds, you plant it, you have to separate meiser again. So isn't this like every single situation? That's the Gemara Shaila. So the Gemara says, Amrle, Davar Shezare Kala Loi Mi Boile. Kim Boile Davar Shein Zare Kala. The average seed breaks down and decomposes. When it breaks down and decomposes, of course you have to separate meiser again, because, okay, I have these seeds. I separate meiser. Fine. I plant them. What happens is the item doesn't just grow from it. The seed breaks down, becomes nothing, and then from that it comes growth. So of course you have to separate meiser again, because that original seed that you separate meiser doesn't exist anymore. But we're talking about wheat kernels that still exist, and because they still exist, they're still here. I could still see them. It's just coming like a bulb of an onion. It's just coming from it. I could argue maybe meiser does not have to be separated a second time, as opposed to every seed where it has to break down. So the Gemara says, Tiv Shalei, I have an answer. Mihada Amrav Yitzchak, Amrav Yechanan, Litra Batzel Shetiknu. You have a litra of onions that you separated meiser, Vizaroi, and then you planted them, Misashal Fikuloi. You have to re-separate meiser. So, meaning, every single onion, I said onions before. I probably shouldn't have done that. But every single onion, you separate meiser on the onions. You take some of the bulbs, you replant them, and there's no such heter as I don't have to take meiser anymore because it was already done. The answer is when it regrows or grows anew, there's now a new need for meiser. So isn't that so? What's our case? Our case is grain. How is grain different than onions? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you the difference. Hasam hainu zarinu. Onions, replanting it is the ordinary planting method. So because it's the ordinary planting method, it makes sense you have to separate meiser again. But hacha lav hainu zarase. When it comes to grain, replanting is not the ordinary method of planting. I'll just read it. Grain is customarily grown from seed, not replanted ears. So because it's not normal to do this, perhaps we don't look at it as a new entity. Meaning apparently by onions, because that's the way to plant onions, we look at it as that's the derech, and therefore it's considered a new plant. But when it comes... Correct, but my point is, even over here we're doing the ears of grain, it also is not breaking down, but it's not normal to do this. Apparently it's not normal to plant ears of grain, it's normal to plant seeds, and therefore it's unclear whether it's the same. So the Gemara says, well, I have a similar shaila. Similar shaila about the meiser with the seeds, not the seeds, the grain. I have a similar shaila. What is the halacha regarding meiser, trumas and meisers from an otzitz she'eino nakuv? An otzitz she'eino nakuv means that you're growing it in a flower pot, but there's no perforation, so it's just like on the table. There's no connection to the ground. Are you able to separate trumas and meisers? Now, stop right there. That's a very strange question because I'll tell you why. I could already answer before we see it. Otzitz nakuv, where it's perforated and it's considered growing from the ground, that's truma meiser deraisa. Otzitz she'eino nakuv is trumas meiser derabanan. I don't know what the shaila is. The answer is yes, derabanan. So the Gemara says, and the Gemara says, Eloi nakuv, haloi nakuv. And if you want to say the shaila is maybe, can I separate from one non-perforated plant for another non-perforated plant? Meaning, I have 10 of them in front of me. I have 10, I'm growing a fruit in 10 non-perforated plants. I want to just take one and cover the rest 9 for meiser. The answer is, yeah, why not? They're all derabanan, so why can't I, right? Derabanan for derabanan. That's a win. Well, why not? So the Gemara says, here's the shaila, chazar v'nakvay ka'amrit. Here's the case. I have a plant that started off not perforated, so it started derabanan. Then while it's growing, let's say it's a third of the way grown, I perforate the bottom, so now the 2/3 is deraisa. So the question is, what do I do here? Can I separate meiser? Because the Gemara sort of looked at it, it's this interesting situation. The Gemara feels that this is very similar. Yeah. Over here, the root itself is derabanan. What grew from it is deraisa. So the question is, we had a question before, do you look at it as an extension of the root or not? Well, this is a very interesting thing, because if you look at it as an extension of the root, it's only derabanan. If you look at it separate, you have a problem. If you look at it as 2 separate fruits that are growing within one item, you have a problem here. Some of it's deraisa, some of it's derabanan. What do? Normally, when you have a plant, you take some of the plant, and that fixes the whole plant. But here's the problem. If some of the plant is derabanan, some of the plant is deraisa, and you're telling me there's a possibility that I have one orange that I could look at as separate, so then what do I do here? I don't even know what to do, because if I take away a little bit, I can't take derabanan for deraisa. So what do I do? It's a problem. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a shaila. Our discussion of looking at the roots with the seeds, the Gemara says, Hacha, over here, you for sure can do it. Why? Chada zriyahi. Over here, it's one long planting. But ichburi, hu deka mechaber v'oila. And it's just attaching later on. But hasam, in the case of the ears of grain, shtei zriyas ninu. Meaning, although we were discussing before, when you have ears of grain that were planted once and then you replant them, how do you look at the replanted ears of grain? Is it a new planting and therefore the original meiser does not help, or is it an extension? That's where it was planted twice. Over here, because it was planted once, even though you perforate it in the middle, it's considered one long planting. You could just separate some of it, and there's no problem. So it's not exactly the same as the discussion we had before. Okay, one more shaila, and then the rest of the daf is pretty simple. We have a rule. You cannot have trumas and meisers attached to the ground. That's a general rule. Well, very simply, because in order for it to be chayiv, it's very practical. It's like, why could you, it's like a riddle. Why could you never have truva attached to the ground? Because it's only chayiv and truma after it's detached from the ground. So you practically can't do it. The Gemara says, I think I have a clever way of potentially making trumas attached to the ground. The Gemara says like this: Boy Ravo. Ravo says, I have a shaila. She boilers, I have an ear of grain. Shemarcha Bakri. I detach it. I do the spreading. It's now chayiv, trumas, maisis, daraisa. It's chayiv. I don't separate trumas and maisis. Here's what I do. I plant it in the ground. I put it in the ground. Now it didn't take root yet. V'kara Hashem b'mechuber. And I say that that's going to be the truma for other stuff. Does it work? You normally cannot have trumas and maisis attached to the ground. Over here, though, it was detached, and then I re-put it in the ground. And then while it's in the ground, I say, that's going to be truma for my other grouping. Does that work? So the Gemara says, put it in the ground, planted it, I replanted it. No, it did not attach, no roots, just stuck it in the ground, and I said, that's going to be truma for the other 50 years of grain. So the Gemara says, Kivan de marcha tavlala, kikar lashem kachala. Do you say, well, it was an ear of grain that was chayiv in trumas and maisus, which means until separate truma it's tevel. You called it trumas and maisus. Why not? It should work. Oy dilma, or perhaps kiven de shasla. The second you replant it, pakala tavla mine, it restarts the clock. I mean, the second you replant it, it's no longer its previous identity as requiring trumas and maisus doesn't exist anymore. We look at it as now a new plant. And now, once it's the new plant, in order to be chayiv in trumas and maisus, you have to take it out and redo the system. Meaning, do we say that merely replanting in the ground restarts the trumas and maisus clock? The trumas and maisus clock begins the second it's called miruach, where you take all the grain and you make it in a smooth pile. That's when the trumas and maisus clock begins. But now it's chayiv in trumas and maisus deraisa. I took it and I put it in the ground. The question is, by putting it in the ground and replanting it, does that restart the clock and it's no longer chayiv in trumas and maisus anymore because it's now a plant again? Or you say, no, it's like the shayla we had yesterday. It's just underground. It's like in the container underground. That's the shayla. So the Gemara says, I have a proof that it doesn't work. Why? Because Amri la Rabbanan la Abaya im kain, if this taka works, then matzinu truma b'mechub l'karka. You found a case where you could have truma connected to the ground.
If you hold it connected to the ground.
Correct. If this works, meaning correct, but let's assume that that's considered mechuber, and let's assume that the truma works. So then you have truma mechuber l'karka. And by the way, so what? So I have truma mechuber l'karka. But tanan, now that would be fine. You could say, well, okay, you get a prize. You found truma mechuber l'karka. The problem is there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, loy matzinu truma mechuber l'karka. There's no such thing as truma mechuber l'karka. That's the Mishnah says. I don't know. It's all kind of circular. Correct. Whether it's mechuber l'karka or not. Correct. No. Trumas maiser was not. Whether meiser would oimer, it was oimer, shvua, and oina. We didn't talk about trumas maiser yesterday, so this would be a raya potentially. Yeah, potentially. So the Gemara says not necessarily so. I'll tell you why. It could be itaka is truma, and it is mechuber l'karka, and you have a case of truma mechuber l'karka. I thought the Mishnah says you don't. No. What the Mishnah said is not that you can't have truma mechuber l'karka. Maybe what the Mishnah means is I, as a non-kohen, can never be chayiv for eating truma mechuber l'karka. So I'll tell you why. Let's say there's a possibility, there's a mitzias where you could have truma connected to the ground. What the Mishnah means is I, as a Yisrael, can never be chayiv for eating it. I'll tell you why. If I detach it from the ground to eat it in the normal way that a human eats, then it's not mechuber l'karka anymore. So then it's just an example of a Yisrael eating truma. A Yisrael eating truma mechuber l'karka, the only way for that to happen is for me to bend down to the ground and eat it while attached to the ground. That's not considered normal derech achila. So while it's aser, it's not going to be chayiv in the punishments that are normally attained. So it could be you could have truma mechuber l'karka. All the Mishnah means is due to a technicality, you can never be punished for that because the only way to have it mechuber l'karka is to eat it while attached to the ground. That's not normal derech achila. Perhaps that's what the Mishnah means. So the Gemara says, Amar le, kitani when the Mishnah says there's no truma mechuber l'karka, it's le'inin ichyuve misa. It means that you will not have misa b'dei shamayim. Right? The punishment for Yisrael eating truma is misa b'dei shamayim. That you won't have when it's mechuber l'karka. Why? And chaimish, by the way, and also when you eat it, you have to. If you do it, you have inadvertently. You have to. If you do it on purpose, it's chaimish b'shmayim. If you do it accidentally, you have to repay the kain plus a chaimish. That you won't have if it's mechuber l'karka. I'll tell you why. Because tolish v'achal, if you detach it from the ground and eat it, well then it's not mechuber l'karka anymore. Tolishu igachin v'achal, and if you eat it while it's attached to the ground, batal daita it's a kaladin. that's not the normal derech achila, and therefore you won't be punished. The Torah aser is the normal achila. If you eat something, Pesach, right? Coming up on Pesach, right? Someone has asked Rav Kalman about whether shampoo is a problem for chametz, and he said no, because he says it has to be royal achilas kelev. So he says, I once saw a dog, such a yeshiva question. I once saw a dog eat shampoo. He says it's a kelev shaita. He says that wasn't a smart dog. So, meaning, a Pesach, if you eat something that's inedible, then you're not chayiv. Why? Because, maybe it's just darabanan shan, but it's not going to be chayiv kares, because it's not the derech achila. So maybe that's what the Mishnah means. So by the way, according to this, if I were to bend down and eat something attached to the ground, while it's attached to the ground, it would not be considered a normal derech achila. Here's the interesting shayla. The Gemara says, "Umay shna." Why is this different? Mid the katav apinkasa de Ilfas. Ilfa's ledger. Ilfa wrote down Torah. He was famously with a boat, and he wrote down ledger. On his ledger, he wrote down Torah, and he said the following: "Beitzei nevelas ha'oiv hatahar." Okay, you have a chicken that was not shechted properly. It's called a nevelas oiv tahar. Now, the halacha is that if you eat that chicken, and the second it goes in your mouth, you are going to be tameh. The second you eat the chicken, you're tameh. It's called tumas nevelas oiv. Yeah. What if they shech the chicken? And there are eggs. Some of the eggs are inside the animal, and some of the eggs are attached outside of the animal. So this says the Gemara, Miktsasan beye nevelas oiv tahar. You have some of these eggs from this unslaughtered chicken. Miktsasan mechutz. Some of them are outside of the bird. Miktsasan bifnim. Some of them are still inside the cavity of the bird. Mibifnim. The eggs are within. Mitam and begad ma beis abliya. If you eat the ones from within, you're going to be tameh. Ma bibachutz. But if you eat the ones outside, the aimatam beis abliya. Outside is not considered part of the animal. Eggs, when they leave the animal, are not considered part of the animal. What's the point, though? How do you eat the eggs that are inside the chicken without them being outside the chicken? You put your head in the chicken and you eat it. And then in your tameh. So when it comes to a chicken, it is the normal way to eat it while it's attached to the chicken inside. But the grain attached to the ground, not normal. What's the difference? Says the Gemara, I'll tell you. Tolush of the inish da'achli hachli. Detached from the ground like a chicken. Sometimes people will just eat it, like they'll put the head in the chicken. They'll eat that's how they'll eat it. Mechuber, attached to the ground, loy of the inish da'achli. No one eats attached to the ground that way. And therefore, it just depends on what food you're talking about. Okay, let's get to the Mishnah and then continue. The Mishnah, by the way, from the end of the Mishnah, it's very, very quick. The Gemara says like this: Amrav Timyu bar Kisna Amar Shmuel Hazareya Klayim Ba'atzchein Enakev Aser. If you plant Klayim in a non-perforated plant, so you have a plant that's not attached to the ground, no hole to attach it to the ground. If you plant Klayim in this flower pot, it's Aser D'Rabbanan. Okay. So says the Gemara, Amar Abaya, what's the chiddush of this? Listen, if you tell me that there's rabbinic lashes, okay, fine. What's the point? What are you telling me? That it's rabbinically considered planting in a non-perforated flower pot. Here's the thing. You want to tell me that you get lashes rabbinically? Okay, you're telling me the actual practical punishment, fine. But if you're not telling me the lashes, what are you telling me, that it's considered rabbinically planting? I know it's rabbinically planted. I told you before that you have to separate Trumas and Maises D'Rabbanan. So what do you have to tell me? If you have to separate Trumas and Maises D'Rabbanan, then it's definitely rabbinically planting for Klayim. So what's the chiddush? Says the Gemara, Ela Aser Ma'ikamash Shmuel, the Rabbanan have a Zriya, Tanina, Tara Mishain and Nakav al Nakav, Truma v'Yasav Yitrim. You're not able to separate Truma on the non-perforated plant for the perforated, because the non-perforated is only D'Rabbanan. So you see it's D'Rabbanan. So what's the chiddush of this? That he didn't understand what the point is. Okay, new Mishnah. The Mishnah will list different types of grains regarding Chadash, regarding, as we'll see in a moment, Pesach. What is considered bread? So the Mishnah says, Chitin wheat, Hasarin barley, Hakusmin spelt, Shibaylu shul oats, Hashifa in rye, Harei elu chayavin bechala. These are the 5 grains that if you make dough out of it, you're chayav to separate chala. Umitzdarfim zeh b'zeh, and they combine with each other. Meaning, if you have a dough that's partially spelt and partially oats, it combines together for the shear of chala. Asurim b'chadash. These 5 materials are asur in chadash. Milifnei ha'omer. Before the omer is brought, you're not allowed to eat these 5 grains. Umiliktzar milifnei pesach. And if you remember, we talked about this a little bit once, that you're not able to cut you're not able to harvest this grain before Pesach, meaning you're not allowed to eat it until the Omer is brought on the first day of Chol Hamoed, but there's an Isser of harvesting in the normal way lest you come to eat it, and all of these are included. Now, when are these considered? When is the Omer Mater, these 5 grains? We've had this before. If they took root before the Omer Matirun, the Omer is Mater them. In Lav, Asur and Omer Abba. If they did not take root before the Omer, then the Omer is not Mater and they have to wait for next year. Okay. So Tana, the Brisa, talks about these 5 grains. Again, it's wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and rye. Kusmin min chitin. Spelt is a type of wheat. Shiboy l'shul v'shifin min sa'arim, and oats and rye are in the barley family. Okay? Kusmin, the Gemara continues weiter. Spelt, go to the next page. Gulva is gulva. Shifoin is dishra. I guess these were terms that they had back then. And shiboy l'shul is shibuli tala. That was the way to identify these items. Okay, Hani these are the 5 grains that are considered chayiv and chala. Oiriz v'daichen loy. You know what's excluded from this? Oiriz and daichen. Oiriz is rice, and daichen, according to many Rishonim, is millet. Those are not considered grains. They are not considered chayiv in chala. How do I know that these are not considered grains for challah? Amrei Shlakish, Aisya lechem mimatzah. It says lechem by challah and it says lechem by matzah. Only the grains that you could be yaitz and matzah on Pesach, as opposed to rice and millet, which you're not yaitz and rice on Pesach. Ksiv hacha v'haya b'cha melechem aretz. Ksiv hasam lechem ayni. V'hasam guven. How do I know that rice and millet are not acceptable for Pesach? How do you know? Maybe I could have matzah out of rice. Maybe rice matzah is acceptable. So I'll tell you why. Minalan Amrei Shlakish Chintan b'Rav Yishmael Chintan b'Rav Elazar ben Yaakov Amar Kra Oy loy soichal of chametz shivas yom teichel matzahs lechem oyni. The pasuk says you shall not eat chametz. You only eat matzah. The connection is you're only able to be yaitz and matzah with something that could turn into chametz. Rice and millet can never turn into chametz, and therefore you're not yaitz and matzah. And because you're not yaitz and matzah, so the source you're not yaitz and matzah is because it's not roila chametz. Because it can't become chametz, like kidneys can never become chametz. It's a minig. It's not actually chametz. So, because rice can never become chametz, it's not roila matzah. Because it's not roila matzah, you can't use it for challah. Devar maban lechimatz on yaitz and pesach yatzu elu she'ein ban lechimatz eladei sirchain. Rice and millet will never become chametz, they'll become sirchain, which means they'll just spoil. They will never actually rise to the type of chametz that the Torah asks. Umitztarfim zeh, the Mishnah said that they combine together, that wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye combine together. The Gemara has a shaila. They combine together for what halacha? Tana, hatvua v'akimachim v'abetzikas. The Brisa says, unmilled kernels of grain. So you have grain with the chaff on it, whatever, and flour and dough, mitztarfim zemzeh, are all one unit that they combine together. So you have the dough, you got the flour, and you got the unmilled grain with the chaff, whatever. It's all one thing to be combined together. So the Gemara wants to know, regarding what halacha do they combine together? L'may hilchasa, for what halacha do they combine together? So a couple answers. Amr of Kahana in chadash, regarding chadash, meaning that if I eat a kezayis of these 3 things together before the Omer, I get lashes. Rav Yosef Amar Lini Chametz Pesach. Rav Yosef says regarding chametz that if you eat a kezayis, you chayiv kares of a combination of dough and flour and tvua. And Rav Papa Amar Lini Meiser Sheni. Diachli chutz l'chaim alaki. Meiser Sheni, if it's eaten outside of Yerushalayim, you get lashes. So if it's a combination of these 3, will be the shir that I'm chayiv lashes for eating it outside of the Chaymis Yerushalayim. Rav Amar, a fourth and final explanation in Tumas Eichlin, regarding Tumas Eichlin, meaning the halacha is that food is able to transmit Tumah if it's the size of an egg, if it's the size of a beya. But it has to be a beya's worth of actual food, of edible food. The halacha is these combined together. But what do you see? Regarding Tumas Eichlin, Hokamashma, what's the chiddush? The tvua v'kemachin dumi de betzikas. Mahosam uchla be'ena avhachanami uchla be'ena. The dough is completely edible. So too the tvua has to be completely edible, meaning without the shell. So if you have a shell, it does not combine for the shear of food regarding transmission of tumah. Transmission of tumah only applies if it's actually edible food, like the dough. So if, let's say, I have a cup of tvua, I have to deduct the amount that's the inedible casings. That does not count. It only counts the dough, the flour, and the actual edible parts of the tefua regarding the shear of a kebeya. V'hatanya, we have a brisa that backs this up, that you do not combine the inedible parts regarding the shear of tumas eichlin. Chita, it says a kernel of wheat. Bein klufa, bein shein klufa, mitzdarefes. Whether it's peeled or not, it's considered part of the shear. Why? Because the husk of wheat kernels are edible. So the shell is considered achila because it's edible. But barley, where the shell of barley is not edible, klufa mitzdarefes, Eina klufa, eina mitzdarefes. Only if it's peeled is it mitzdaref, but if it's not peeled, it's not mitzdaref. Meaning we do not combine together the dough with the kernels, with the husks, because the husks are not edible by barley. So when it comes to the mitzdaref for achila, we've done a few minutes. When it comes to mitzdaref for achila, we do not combine the shells that are inedible. Says the Gemara, "Ini, is this true?" But Rabbi Shmuel, doesn't the Brisa say, "Al kol zera zeru asher yizareya kederach shbri adam moitzim l'zriya chita b'klipasoi sur b'klipasoi v'adashim b'klipasoi." The Brisa says that regarding the shear for food transmission of tumah, we combined a wheat in its husk, a barley in its husk, and lentils in their husk. So we said. At one point, we're saying that barley in the husk does not count because it's not royal achila, but over here it says it does count. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Loi kasha, habalachos, habiyaveshus. The answer is, to be considered oichel regarding the transmission of tumah, you either need it to be edible, or it has to be a functionality. It has to protect the shell. If you have the outer casing of like an orange, while it may not be edible, but it's protecting the orange flesh inside, so then it's considered part of the food itself. The stira is the barley husk food or part of the food or not? The answer is it depends. If it's moist, when apparently the barley is moist, the husk protects it. Once it protects it, then it's considered part of the oichel. Even though it's not edible, but at least it's protecting. When it's dry, it's not protecting it, and it's not edible, it doesn't count. Just to finish up, the Gemara had said, Hasurim b'chadash lefnei ha'omer, all these are forbidden to eat before the omer comes. Minan emili, how do I know this? Amrei shlakish, aisya lechem lelechem and matzah. Again, how do I know that these are the 5 grains? The answer is, whatever it is by matzah, it is by chadash as well. Liktzer lefnei Pesach, minan emili. How do I know that you're not allowed to harvest these before Pesach? There's an issur of harvesting before Pesach in the normal way because we're afraid you come to eat it. Rav Yechanan, Aisya, Reishis, Mechala. We learn out from Chala, just like Chala it's these materials, so too the issur applies to these 5 materials as well. Now, just to finish up, what are you not allowed to do? What my koidim la'omer? So Rav Yoina Omer, koidim kitsiris ha'omer. When does the food become mutter? So we've been going with this presumption the whole time that the carbon is materit. Rav Yonah says, Kitsiras ha'omer. The simple way to read Rav Yonah is that the harvesting of the grain is materit, not the actual carbon itself, but the preparation for the carbon is mater chadash, which, by the way, is a tremendous chiddush. The Gemara is going to reject in a moment. Rav Yossi bar Zavda Amar Kodim Havasa Amar. Rav Yossi bar Zavda says, no, it's the carbon that's mater, not the cutting of the barley. By the way, they bring the carbon on the first day of Chol HaMoed. They cut it the night before. Rav Yoina says the night before, when they cut the barley, that's already when the chadash is mutter. Says the Gemara, is this true? T'nan. Doesn't the Mishnah say, we'll end with this, Asurim b'chadash l'fnei ha'omer, v'liktzeh l'fnei ha'pesach. Now, the Mishnah said there's 2 things. You're not allowed to eat the carbon, you're not allowed to eat chadash until the omer, which pashas means until the omer is brought. And you're not allowed to harvest it until Pesach. Now, bishlam da omer koid mavasa omer hainu deloika arav l'vitanalu. According to Rav Yoina, that what's mutter, according to Rav Yoina, when are you allowed to eat the grain? When you cut it. When are you allowed to harvest it? When you cut it. They're both at the same time. So why not put it together? So the Gemara says, you're right, we'll end with this. Rav Yoina does not actually mean that the carbon, harvesting for the carbon is mater chadash. There's no way. Eli itmar asefa itmar. Im heshrishu koidim la'omer ha'im matiron, my koidim la'omer. Rav Yoina omer, koidim la'vos ha'omer, Rav Yossi bar Zavda omer, koidim kitziras ha'omer. The answer is like this. Everyone agrees that the chadash is only mutter when the actual carbon is brought. The machlekes is, we said before, the omer is only matter if it took root. The question is, when do I have to check whether it took root? Rav Yoina says, if it took root before harvesting the night before, then the omer is matter. But Rav Yossi bar Zavda says, no, it has to take root by the carbon omer. Even if it didn't take root the night before, if it took root by the carbon omer is brought, that itself is matter. I will stop here.